Amazon, etc. And we'll be posting it on Facebook.
Human by Design.
Human by Design.
Yep, close.
Designed to Heal. I've got in my head.
Okay, I've got 58. So 10:58. So, okay, thanks for doing this, Lynn. Have a good time.
You too. You have a great time. Yeah, just enjoy it.
Yeah.
We're live now. Hey, everybody. Welcome to Design to Heal, which is a teleseminar that I'm running with my great friend, Gregg Braden. And we are so excited to be here. Hi, Greg.
Hey, Lynn, from across the ocean. I'm coming to you today from the high desert of northern New Mexico, and it's late morning my time, and I'm going to say hello to all my family across the ocean. It's late afternoon, I guess, early evening your time.
Absolutely, it's early evening. The clocks have just gone back, but it's about 5 o'clock, and it was cold and rainy, and we had hail yesterday in London. But it's nice and warm here, being with you guys and everybody across the world who's watching this now. So we have a really exciting hour together. Greg and I are great friends, but I want to tell you a little bit about Greg and also a little bit about what we're going to be doing. Greg is, if you don't know him, I'm sure you all do, is a real fantastic central voice in science and spirituality and human potential. He's written 5 New York Times best-selling books. His latest book is Human by Design. He is a Templeton Award nominee, and he's just one of the world's great guys. So I'm just thrilled to have him here with me to talk about all the things we want to talk about today, which is about really healing, instant healing, and why we were born to heal.
Yeah, well, Lynn, I want to tell you how honored I am to be with you. And I'm certain that everyone on this broadcast knows who you are. But, you know, from my perspective, I knew about your work before I had the opportunity to meet you. And one of the things I so love and appreciate about you, Lynn, is that your objectivity, you've got the journalistic training. And when you wrote the book, The Field, you and I were writing on similar topics just about the same time. And that tells me that it was in the field for us to talk about the field. We were both documenting the science that leaves no doubt that we are connected in ways that simply have been discounted in the past. And what that connection, it changes everything. So you are such a powerful voice, Lynn, in terms of the way that you have shared this, and you've brought it to an audience that sometimes might be a little skeptical about this kind of work. And that's the beauty of what you do and what we're doing here today. Everyone learns differently, and everyone hears words and language differently and relates to the information differently. And you have brought this idea of a field so current, so mainstream. And as you said, you and I, we're now friends. We have the opportunity, our paths cross on the conference circuit. We meet in some of the coolest places in the world.
We do.
Yeah, and I just really appreciate your dedication, your perseverance to bring to light the deepest truths of our existence and what we now know about our relationship to this field and what it means to our own bodies. And I'm honored to be on the Watkins list and any other lists that we're on, because what that says is that this work is being noticed. And not only that, but it's meaningful. And that's the key, to share these new discoveries in a meaningful way, something that touches us in our lives that we can apply day in and day out. So you are such a master at doing this, Lynn, and you are also just a really genuinely nice person. Whenever I see your name on the list of who I'm going to be presenting with, I see your name and I get a big smile because I know it's going to be a good conference. So thank you for sharing this with me today.
Thank you. And me as well. I mean, one of the great things about Greg is that he digs up. He has a great and interesting new take on everything he researches. And he's a master at discovering deep truths too. And
can I say something? I just want to say something about this really quick. It's a funny story. I did an interview not long ago, and as an author, I know that you know not all interviews are as warm and friendly and fuzzy as this one is. And this interviewer, the first thing the interviewer said to me, he didn't say, welcome me to the program or anything. He just He said, Greg, why can't you stick with one topic? Why can't you stick with one subject? Like everybody else does, just write a bunch of books about one thing. He said, you're all over the place. Are you talking about fractal time or the God code or the field that connects us or healing or spirituality? And I listened and I said, I understand what you're saying. I said, every one of the books that I've written and everything that you've just mentioned, it explores one facet of us and our relationship to our own bodies, our relationship to the past, to the earth, to the cosmos. So in a very real sense, every book is talking about the same topic. It's just a big topic. It's us. And, he heard that and he said, okay, let's go to the station break. And then they didn't talk about it anymore.
Well, this is it. I mean, you and I basically have, write about our enthusiasms or our curiosity. And one thing leads to another thing. And then that needs to be explored. And truly, for me, I never really expected to be on this path. I mean, I was breaking baby selling rings when I started out in my 20s. I was an investigative reporter. And I got drawn into doing the book, The Field, because I kept discovering these great studies showing that things like spiritual healing work. And I kept thinking to myself, well, if that's true, that undermines everything we think about how we work and how the universe works. If you can have a thought and send it to someone else and make them better, then that changes the whole ballgame. And of course, that's really what we do. We look at what perhaps a little inkling of something and pull that thread until a whole new story is revealed. So I want to ask you something, Greg. Your latest book really interests me, Human by Design, because you write about why Darwin was wrong about survival of the fittest and the implications for, healing and thriving. If he was wrong, he really kind of describes a very barren dog-eat-dog world. And tell me a bit about some of the things that you discovered that have some sort of connection with our ability to heal.
Sure, Lynn. Well, thank you. First, I just want to be really clear with all of our community that we're talking to today, our family. I have a lot of respect for Charles Darwin. Some people think I don't because I criticize his work. I have a tremendous respect for Darwin. Darwin could not possibly have known in his day, 150 years ago, what we know today. He could not possibly have known about DNA the way that we do. Just to give you an example, 150 years ago, scientists knew about cells, and they thought cells were little sacks of water in our body, and that was it. They didn't know anything else was inside the sack of water. So he could not have known, and he was very clear when he put forth his theory, he expected his theory to fall. When new discoveries overturned what he had found. He was attempting to move us from religion to science when it comes to answering the big questions of life. Who are we? Where do we come from? How do things work in the world? How do we relate to our own bodies? So Darwin was okay if his theories fell. It's the academia today that is struggling to hang on to those theories specifically, and in general, there is we're witnessing a battle playing out in the mainstream to hang on to what is called the standard model. And your work is part of that, Lynn, and mine is as well. It's the standard model of physics, the standard model of human origins, the standard model of the way things work. So money, power, ego, habit, all play a role in hanging on to this old story on the one hand, and on the other hand, the new discoveries, new evidence no longer support the old story. So that's why it's time for a new story. And that's my books are describing different facets of that story. So when it comes to us, one of Darwin's key tenets, Darwin released his book in 1859 on Origin of Species. And the idea of evolution, slow, gradual change over long periods of time, and that we evolved from very simple forms of life during that time within what was called a dead universe. So the thinking at the time was the universe is sterile, it's dead. These things just the Big Bang just happened to occur, and we came along relatively late. We are insignificant in the universe. These are Darwinian ideas, and that it is that the fundamental rule of nature is competition, conflict, struggle, scarcity. And because we're here, he justified the fact that we're here today. He said the competition must work because we're here. So when I share that with my audiences, a lot of people say, yeah, it was 150 years plus ago. What difference does it make? And they're surprised to know that the foundations of the society that we live in today were being formed during that time. And these ideas were incorporated into the economic model, that the economy is based on competition and conflict, corporate models. The healing model of the human body was based upon a mechanistic view of us as a bunch of parts. And when a part breaks, you try to fix it. If you can't fix it, replace it. If you can't replace it, it's all over. So those ideas are deeply entrenched into the medical model and the way we think of ourselves today, as well as the big picture of what's happening on the global stage. The way that resources are being shared between nations, the way that we're solving our problems, they're all based on this idea, survival of the strongest, which, by the way, these were Darwin's actual words, was survival of the strongest. Survival of the fittest came along later, a later interpretation, but his actual book, the words, he said survival of the strongest. So these ideas, we're trying to solve problems, in the Middle East, survival of the strongest. We're trying to solve the problems of disappearing amounts of water and food. And we're globalizing a world and pushing together populations and cultures and religions and the way men think about women and women think about men, all based upon these old ideas of survival of the strongest, competition, conflict. It's not working. So my book was to show the new discoveries that have overturned those ideas. And I think one of the most powerful in terms of the healing that we're talking about, Lynn, is the idea, what the science is showing, DNA evidence has overturned everything. We can now extract the DNA from the fossilized remains of the beings that were believed to be our ancestors. And what the DNA is telling us is we didn't descend from Neanderthal. We didn't descend from these primitive forms of life that you see on the evolutionary family tree. The DNA does show us that we showed up. We appeared on Earth about 200,000 years ago. And scientists agree with that. There's no controversy there. But we showed up with no evolutionary path leading to us. Mm-hmm. And the DNA that is being pulled from the bone marrow of what are called anatomically modern humans, it's the same as ours today. We haven't changed in this period of time. We were fully enabled, fully intact. We had the neocortex that gives us our humanness, our empathy, sympathy, compassion, the ability to self-regulate our biology. We had that already intact. The extended neural network we're going to talk about, the vagus nerve and the nervous system, it's been with us from the beginning. It did not develop slowly, gradually over a long period of time. And this has led to what scientists call forbidden territory, because the precision of the way that the DNA was put together to give us these capabilities, scientists say, is beyond something that evolution can produce. It suggests an intention. It implies a purpose. And where that leads me is the question: we have these extraordinary abilities to self-regulate our biology, to self-heal, to regenerate, to rejuvenate. Every organ in the human body now is documented with that ability. So how do we awaken those in our lives? And that's what the new book is all about. The first half of the book is the science of the new discoveries, and we can talk about some of those. And the second half is how do we apply those discoveries in our lives. And this is where I think it fits, it meshes so beautifully with your new book, Lynn, The Power of Eight, because you're picking up with where my book leaves off. How do we awaken these extraordinary abilities? And your book is very specific about how we relate to the field that we now know, peer-reviewed science is telling us is there. How do we consciously regulate our relationship to that field when it comes to us and other people, when it comes to our own healing? And this is where our mastery really begins. And it's a very different way of thinking for many people. So that's why I so respect you're so precise with your words, and the clarity and the science underlying what it is that you're sharing honors people who are just tipping their toes into the water for the first time, because this is such a very different way of thinking. So in a sense, in a nutshell, that's what the new book and what that work is all about.
Well, thank you. And what I think is so interesting, and where our work does mesh too, is my last book, The Bond, also looked at this whole idea that, as you say, Darwin was just a man of his time, but he didn't realize what an enormous impact he was going to have. And in defining life, essentially metaphorically, as struggle. Life is war. It's a race to the finish line. And that became a kind of metaphoric model for so many things, when exactly the reverse is true. When you actually look at our biology and our ability to heal, we were programmed not to compete. We were programmed to share, care, and be fair. And all of those things are really important. And one of the biggest things that really framed my thinking about the Power of Eight was the need for connection. When I looked at our need for belonging, it was so shocking to me, because I realized that, human beings need to belong more than they need to eat. The worst thing that any tribe can do is to ostracize one of its members. And when you look at suicide statistics, you find that invariably these are people who don't feel they don't fit in. They have what psychologists call excessive individuation. They feel left out. And then when you look at the science of healing, you find that, some studies showing that connection, belonging as part of a community can protect you from stroke, from heart disease, even from the common cold. And when you look at studies of the Japanese, they're really interesting in demonstrating this, because the Japanese smoke like chimneys, but they don't get heart disease. And except when some of them when they transplant to places like the US, some then develop the heart disease risk of ordinary Americans, Native Americans, and some don't. And when epidemiologists have looked closer, they've found that diet has nothing to do with it. That, they could be eating tofu and sushi or Big Macs and fries. Doesn't matter. But what matters is whether or not they're able to recreate the close community ties that they had in the old country. So that whole idea of needing to connect is really evident to me in what I've observed and what I discovered essentially by accident in trying to apply group intention. For me, Greg, it's all about, I approach this with a degree of healthy skepticism. There wasn't very much woo-woo about me when I got into this field. And I was a skeptic about the power of intention. And that's why I set up this thing called the intention experiment, to test it on a big scale, to get scientists to set up experiments, and then to have my readers around the world, my books are in 30 languages, to come onto my website every so often and send an intention to a target. I was pretty sure it wasn't going to work, but it really worked. I mean, we've done 33 experiments now, everything from trying to make seeds grow faster, to trying to make, to try to purify water, to lowering violence in war-torn or violent areas, to even healing somebody of post-traumatic stress disorder. And of those scientifically controlled, scientifically monitored studies, and these are monitored by, scientists at places like Penn State University, University of California, Princeton University. Of those 33, 29 showed measurable positive effects. But that isn't the point of my story, really, or my book. Yes, that's pretty amazing. There isn't a drug out there that shows that kind of, that track record. But what was more amazing, when I scaled it down, just putting people in groups of 8, just to see if they could send an intention to heal somebody, we were getting instant healings, and have got instant healings for the 10 years that I've been doing this with thousands of people. And it's very shocking to me, and it was shocking at the time, until I started to understand the science of connection, the science you're talking about, that we have these latent capacities to heal. We've just been defined so reductively that we don't realize it anymore.
Yeah, well, Lynne, what you're talking about, you and I, we have these conversations all the time, but I present to conferences where there are scientists and medical doctors who typically don't have these kinds of conversations. And so when I share with them the ideas, there can be some reluctance and often even resistance. And then when I share the peer-reviewed science, and I think this is what's important, peer-reviewed science, it's the science, I'm just say this for our viewers, it's a little different than a scientist just writing a paper and throwing it up onto the internet. Peer-reviewed science is where a scientist or a group of scientists, they have a theory, and then they have a hypothesis. They test the hypothesis, and they publish their results among their peers, so the peers can look and see if there are mistakes or errors, and if they'll try to shoot holes in the theory. And it can take years. And when the process is finished, it's published in a peer-reviewed journal, and it is accepted as scientific fact, even though it may not have percolated down into the mainstream. So a lot of the things you and I are talking about are science facts that are simply not showing up in the mainstream, in mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks, mainstream television, cable television documentaries. They're still not showing these things. So I recently had the opportunity. I was at the CERN research facility, the superconducting super collider, recreating the Big Bang to find out what happened in the nano fractions of a second after that primal release of energy that set into motion the laws of physics that we're talking about today. And what CERN has done scientifically is they have said, without any shadow of a doubt, there is a field that exists everywhere. It connects all things. It's the container for whatever it is that we experience individually or between us. It is also the connection between us and what's happening in our world. And it is also a mirror. This field is a mirror that mirrors in our outer world what we claim to be true, what we claim to believe in our subconscious and in our hearts, in our subconscious beliefs. So it is a scientific fact now. We don't have to spend time trying to determine whether or not this field exists. Science has caught up with what you and I were writing about years ago now. And they are also now showing that human DNA through light, through photons, is directly linked to this field, as well as through other properties, but definitely through the light and through what's called entanglement, quantum entanglement. So when we begin to apply these new discoveries to our most ancient and cherished spiritual traditions, the ability to heal remotely, the ability to view remotely, remote viewing, for example, is possible because this field exists. I've talked about that in some of our programs. Then the scientists, they have to make a choice. That's where their workshop begins. One of two things happen. They either discount everything they've seen and they run back to cling to an obsolete model based on the false assumptions of science, of an obsolete science, or they expand the possibilities of what they know, and they begin to incorporate this into their work and into the way that they think about helping other people. But I've spent a lot of my adult life with indigenous peoples. I've studied since the early 1980s. Indigenous people in Tibet and Bolivia and Peru, the southern Andes, Nepal, India, all through the American desert Southwest, Aboriginal peoples. And what really drew me into this, Lynn, was that what I saw was that people were living to advanced ages, and they did not have what we call the diseases of advanced age in our country. So, for example, southern Andes, I am every year I visit populations down there. They don't have breast cancer. They're not dealing with prostate cancer. They don't have Alzheimer's. And we're told that you can expect those as you reach, certain ages here in the Western world. Well, living a Western lifestyle with Western beliefs, I can see where that could be. But what it tells me is it's not about the age. It's about how we live our lives as we attain that age, and the belief systems and community that you're talking about, Lynn, is so important to all of this, because in the community, they accept the healing of one another as if it has already happened. And when they begin to see one another as healed, whether it's emotional healing or physical healing, that healing is reflected in the physical body, in the biology of the people around them. And it's the existence of the field and our genetic relationship to that field, the way our DNA is able to tune and access that field. To begin to think of chromosomes and DNA, begin to think of them as antenna. That's a soft antenna, biological antenna. It's a very, very different way of thinking. But this is what the science is showing, is that the antenna actually tune to very specific places in the field, wavelengths of light, very specific kinds of energy. And the beauty of this is that we regulate through epigenetics, through our beliefs, we regulate how those antennae are forming to tune to that information. So as we begin to accept what the science is telling us, and we see how it parallels so many of our ancient traditions. So the science can tell us how it works. Science tells us about the nuts and the bolts. Science can't always tell us how to apply that. And this is where we go to 5,000 years of spiritual and indigenous experience, because our ancestors began with the understanding that everything is connected. They didn't take 5,000 years to prove it. So they began from that place, and they said, how do we apply this connection in our lives? So they know the applications. The science is telling us the nuts and bolts. You and I, our community, we benefit from these two great ways of knowing: science, indigenous wisdom, and spirituality. And what we're doing is we're weaving this into a wisdom that's greater than the science can be all by itself. Science is good, but it doesn't have all the answers. Spiritual traditions have the techniques, but they don't have the mechanism. So we've reached the point. We've reached the point in the world. The world's changing. We've got to change the way we think and the way we live and our relationship to the world. Science gives us the reason to make those changes. The ancient traditions give us the mechanism, the techniques to implement those changes. And when we begin to affect the healing in our own body and the body of those around us, it reinforces our belief and our deep relationship with nature, our deep relationship with the world around us that we're not separate from, that we're part of. And I think that's where the big shift in thinking really begins, because if that's true, then what else is true? If these relationships are true, then what else can we do with these relationships? And that's where the Power of 8 is showing us, hey, here's what you can do with these relationships. And the work of the Institute of Heart Math is showing us how we implement these. I want to talk about the global implications before we leave here today.
Yes. Well, I think that's so interesting, this whole idea that the field is being proven. As they say, science advances one funeral at a time. And what's really frustrating for me to watch is when I published The Field, which is back in 2001, some of the scientists who had made the discoveries I wrote about, actually have made those discoveries in the 1970s and 1980s. And there were people like Dr. Fritz Albert Popp, a German physicist, who discovered that photons were coming out of DNA, and that we were communicating with the outside world. And his work, he was practically treated like a criminal. And finally, his work got accepted by a small body of 40 scientists. But we're now discovering that he was right all along, as were many of the other scientists talking about how we are in this field. And a lot of people talk about, we can access the field. We're in the field. We're part of the field. Our subatomic particles are helping to create the field. And so we're constantly in there. It's just hard for us to know how to read it. And that is, I think, the real issue for us to relearn what's already there, that we have this latent capacity. Now, for me, as I said, this came about totally by accident. I was running a workshop. I wanted to I hadn't ran many workshops before. This is more than 10 years ago now. And I wasn't really sure what to do, how to show the power of group intention, because I'd only done it on a big scale with 25,000 people joining in big intention experiments. So I just said, hey, I don't know, I'll put people in groups of 8 and have them send healing intention to someone who's in the group to see what happens. And I didn't expect it to be anything more than a feel-good effect. But it wasn't that. When people did this and they came back the next day, we had a woman who had cataracts who said she was 80% better. We had somebody else with terrible knee arthritis who was due for a knee replacement, who was walking normally. We had someone else with terrible insomnia who had a good night's sleep for the first time in years, and someone else with terrible migraines every day of her life who suddenly had a clear head, and on and on and on it went. I dismissed it at the time as a placebo effect until it kept happening over and over and over again in the thousands of groups that I've run. And so it took me 10 years, Greg, to actually want to publish this book because I was pretty frightened by what I was witnessing. But I decided to study it as I do everything else that I do and to try to figure out why this is working. And there are a number of big pieces to it. Well, one of the things that really happened that was so fascinating to me, and you talked before about the field being a kind of mirror to us. Well, what I found was that these groups were having a mirror effect, and I realized that the senders were getting healed too. Give you an example. A guy called Wes Chapman was in part of a group of mine last autumn. Greg, poor Wes, was somebody who was very bright, had been at university, had been at college studying biochemistry, wanted to be a doctor or biochemist. And he was called up then in one of the last years of the Vietnam War where there were no more student deferments. He went, he had such a traumatic time, he came home deeply depressed, didn't finish college, didn't follow his dreams, and his life just descended in a terrible spiral of depression. He even lost the love of his life to a fast-growing cancer. So by the time I met him, he was 65 and feeling like, well, what's the use? Fast forward, he comes into this group and he doesn't put himself forward as the person who's going to receive the healing. He does the healing for someone else because she had stage 4 cancer. He thought she was more deserving, even though he was continuing to be very depressed. So the first night he goes to bed and he wakes up and he has this whole sensory change, like totally heightened sensory awareness. The birds sound more beautiful than they ever have. The grass is greener than it ever has been. And he suddenly, although he had been very isolated and tended to keep to himself, suddenly he was Mr. Social, saying hi to everybody. How you doing? The next day then, he goes to bed the next night and he has this extraordinary dream, almost like a vision, where he imagined meeting his 19-year-old self in college. And the 19-year-old self somehow communicated with him, not through words, but through some sort of feeling that it was going to be okay. There was still time. Since that day, which was last autumn, Wes, I've kept in touch and trying to find out what else happened to him. He's a completely changed person. He's doing 90-minute power walks. He's part of these groups of 8. He's setting up Power of 8 groups. He's starting to write. His life is completely transformed. And all it was one little healing session with a group of 8. And he wasn't even a receiver. He was a sender. So to me, that was mind warping. And I started to see that mirror effect in my giant intention experiments too. We've done 6 peace intention experiments where we've sent intention to an area of high violence. I mean, most recently we did St. Louis, Missouri, which is officially the most violent place in America. And we did the Middle East. We did one for Jerusalem, which I'll talk about a bit later. But we had interesting cases. In both cases, there was a massive lowering of violence in just the area we focused on and not the surrounding areas. 43% from St. Louis from the year before. But that's not even the interesting part of the story. What was really interesting to me was that the people participating in this group intention, this altruistic act, were themselves finding their lives more peaceful. They were making up with estranged partners. They were getting along better with their coworkers and their not so nice bosses. I survey people during all of my experiments, after the experiments to see if anything's changed. They were talking about, and 1/2 of all the people who participated said that they were more in love with everyone they came into contact with. They were getting to the point of hugging strangers. So I started to really think about, wow, what is it here that is so powerful and transformational? And there must be something. Of course, there are group effects. We have a powerful intention stuff, but something even more important is the altruism piece that is really, really powerful in being self-transformational too. Did you want to talk about that and some of the stuff that you discovered?
Well, so we see these effects, Lynn, and I've seen similar effects. I want to share, actually, a story I've never even shared with you. But when we see them in the world and we say, there's something happening here, this is where the better we understand ourselves and our relationship to our body, the better we can understand what is it that facilitates that effect? Why is that effect possible? And once we understand that, we then begin to understand what does it take to create this and what doesn't work, what works and what doesn't work. And the things that don't work, we can stop doing them. The things that do work, we can hone and refine the techniques. And that's what's so beautiful about the stories that you're sharing. You and I, we have such parallel backgrounds in different respects. So brothers and sisters from a different mother. But we, absolutely. For me, we were both in the corporate world. I was in the corporate world as well. And I was spending a lot of time with indigenous people and leading groups into some of the places that I mentioned. And there are places in the jungles of South America, for example, where the indigenous people, they have no access to high-tech medicine at all, or even refrigeration for that matter. So when people get sick, the first time I saw a village shaman do what I'm going to describe to you was one of the keys, one of the things that really told me that something is happening in the field that's not acknowledged, in the way that I was taught to think about myself, my relationship to the world. There are indigenous people in the Southern Andes, when someone is sick and they don't know what's happening in their body, they will take a small animal like a gerbil or a hamster. These were essentially hamsters is what they're using. A living animal, and they would pass the animal through up and down in front of the body. Now, you and I know what they're doing is they're passing it through the energy field of the body. And then what they would find is inside the body of the animal, the guinea pig is what they use, a lot of down there, guinea pigs. Inside the body of the guinea pig would be the condition that the person was experiencing in the moment. That's how quickly that the energy from the human would be reflected in the body of the guinea pig. So if it was an ulcer or if it was a lung condition or whatever in the guinea pig, then they would know what to treat inside the body. They call it jungle x-ray is what they actually called it, jungle x-ray. So I saw that, but then when I saw it in my own life, my mom in the year 2000, I had a phone call with my mom, and I was asking her, I was traveling all over the world, and I would call her every Sunday, and we just check in. And I said, how are you doing? And she says, I'm fine. She had a little terrier at the time, little dog, and she says, I'm worried about my dog. She said the dog has been lethargic, took her to the vet, they did x-rays, and she has black spots all over on her lungs. And she said, what do you think about that? And I said, well, Mom, in my world, of course I'm concerned about your pooch. But I said, in my world, I would be concerned about what's happening with you. I said, have you had a physical recently? And she said, I had one, but I didn't do any x-rays. She was subconsciously putting off the x-rays. She didn't want to do it. And I, through a number of phone calls, finally I just said, go get the x-rays. And she did. And she had spots on her lungs that were cancerous.
Wow.
And they found that when she was a little girl, she'd had tuberculosis undiagnosed. The body had healed and scar tissue had isolated the tuberculosis from the rest of her body, and she'd lived long enough that the scar tissue had become malignant. That you see that happen sometimes. So the reason I'm sharing this, she opted for a surgical option. Mom had 2/3 of her left lung removed. The whole story I read about in one of my books. But the moment that happened, 2 weeks later, she was home. We took her dog to the vet, and all the spots on the dog's lungs had disappeared. So when you see things, you say these are anecdotal. But how often does this happen in our lives? How many of us have pets that we say, my dog or my cat or my rabbit or whatever is sick all the time? They share such intimate space with us. It's very common that they will show the conditions of something in their lives or in their bodies, if we have the wisdom to recognize it, because they're unconditional, they accept us, that is appearing or will show up in our bodies. We have the wisdom to recognize that, then we have this very intimate and healing relationship. If we don't have the wisdom to recognize that, I know people that say, you know, I got to get another dog. This one keeps getting sick all the time. I've had friends that, you know, that have actually said that. So, you know, we see these things playing out in life, where I think the science, the reason there's a disconnect, Lynn, in my experience, when I go, again, to conferences, and we've got professors, university professors, medical doctors, specialists, cardiologists, brain surgeons, and they say they have never heard of the stuff you and I are talking about. So there's nothing in their model that helps them to make sense when they see what we're talking about. They either have to call it a miracle because they don't understand it, or they will call it a misdiagnosis. They say it wasn't understood properly in the first place. Yes. This is where the new discoveries help us as a community, because when we begin I'm saying this 3 times, it's such a different way to think. And yes, we have been so steeped in a story of isolation from ourselves, powerlessness when it comes to our own bodies, separateness from the world, the fact that everything is separate from everything else. And we're teaching our kids this today. So, you know, we hear these philosophical conversations. You take notes and you say, yeah, everything's connected. And then when something happens in your own life, how are we able to embrace these ideas in our own lives? This is where the new science and the discoveries in human by design come in, because the science is giving us a new way to think about our lives, a new model that tells us that we are literally wired to heal, that we are predisposed to self-generation, self-regulation, regeneration, rejuvenation. Every organ in the body now is documented with the ability to heal itself, even the ones that we were told could not. So spinal cord tissue, pancreatic tissue, brain tissue, heart tissue, given the right environment. And the environment, many kinds of environments. It can be a nutritional environment, it helps, but they found the energetic environment. So the emotional environment from within, but the energetic environment from the family, from the community, from their peers. And this is exactly what the Power of 8 is showing, because you are creating a micro environment for the people in that space on one level. Another level, Lynn, because we know about the phenomenon of entanglement, the effects that you're creating with the Power of 8, in all probability on the quantum level, are infinite. And I had this conversation with a scientist at the Institute of Heart Math. One of the discoveries I talk about is the discovery of 40,000 specialized cells in the human heart that are like neurons. Well, they're neural-like cells, but they're not in the brain. They're in the heart. They think, they feel, they remember independently of the brain, and they independently work to facilitate the kinds of healings that you're talking about. Or we can harmonize the heart and the brain together, 2 separate organs, but we create one nervous system using the vagus nerve, using the spinal cord. And when I talk to the researchers about this, Roland McCready from the Institute of Heart Math, for example, brilliant man, leads up their scientific research. And we talked about the information being transmitted between the heart and the brain. The vagus nerve cannot possibly convey the amount of information that's moving between the heart and the brain. And so the thinking now is that much of it is actually being conveyed beyond the physical nerve center through the field, via the field, and in all probability extends on a quantum level infinitely. So this goes back to what you were saying. When we love ourselves, and this is what the acceptance, the forgiveness, all these things that we're talking about, the gratitude that creates this healing chemistry in our bodies, by loving ourselves, the effect is not confined to our physical bodies, but it extends beyond our bodies. And we now know that the human heart is coupled magnetically to the magnetic field of the earth as the strongest magnetic field generator in the human body. And that we humans literally, this isn't a metaphor, but we literally have the ability to influence in positive ways the magnetic fields in our communities, in our societies, and even between nations in ways that facilitate not only healing, but cooperation and peace. So it all comes back to our relationship to this field and the science that says, number one, there is a field. Number two, we are wired to connect to that field. And by following the deepest relationships outlined in our most ancient and spiritual tradition, not religion, but the spiritual traditions, they parallel what the science is telling us, and they give us the techniques to regulate our bodies in healthy, positive, and powerful ways, not only for us, but for our communities as well. And it's all happening at a time when the world is globalizing and the tensions are running at an all-time high. So I think the symmetry is just beautiful.
It really is. And it's so interesting, your work about the vagus nerve and the heart, and the work that I've been doing on the big intention experiments, showing the effects of that when you're talking about healing whole communities or people who are divisive. This is the thing that was really fascinating for me. Last November, I ran a Middle Eastern peace intention experiment I talked about earlier. And I had the good fortune to be able to use some technology that enabled me to have cameras in 9 different locations. Yeah. So because I was part of a Middle Eastern summit, we had cameras in 8 different Arab cities throughout the Gulf states. So we had, some in Saudi Arabia and Kuwait and Bahrain, Oman, Jordan, etc. And the 9th camera we had at an auditorium filled with Israeli Jews. So we did an intention experiment to lower violence in an area of the old city of Jerusalem, which was suffering a lot of violence at the time. And we all came together to do this. Now, the beauty of this technology was that I could speak to them, but they could also speak to me at these different locations. And when I called on them, they would be heard by everybody else in all the different locations. So after we did this intention experiment, it was just remarkable. The Arabs, who remember are brought up, Israelis and Arabs are brought up to hate each other, to kill each other. They believe they have horns growing out of their heads. So the Arabs started saying to the Israelis, your God is our God. The Israelis, everybody was crying. The Israelis were saying, we love you, sister. It's time to finish all of this. And there was just a big love fest going back and forth among people who were very nervous of even connecting with each other at the beginning of this broadcast. And it made it all over the Middle East. It was in all the press, et cetera, about this peace intention experiment, both in Kuwait and places like that, and also the Israeli papers. And what was really fascinating for me was the fact that this altruistic act of just trying to lower violence somewhere, something that shouldn't have any impact on you personally, your personal life, would be so personally transformational. And one of the things that really explained that for me, because I've seen this over and over again, these amazing mirror effects with my intention experiments, as well as the Power of 8 groups. There was some amazing research at the University of California at Berkeley with a guy called Dacher Keltner, who is a professor of psychology, and his focus is on positive psychology, on selfless acts and the fact that we were born to be good. I think that's the name of one of his books. Anyway, he did this amazing study. He had 2 groups of students from Berkeley, and one group was shown photos of the world's victims, like starving children. The other half were shown pictures designed to elicit pride, like pictures of the Berkeley football team and them fighting against Stanford and various things like that. And what he found afterward was the people were shown the world's victims. That activated the vagus nerve. And that not only made them feel more compassion, because the vagus nerve is longest nerve in our body, originates at the neck, winds its way through all the major organs, and it assists in the release of oxytocin, the love hormone that gets activated when we're feeling, compassion towards children, for instance. But it not only does that, it also activates a system that makes us feel closer and more connected to people who are not like us, the other. And they found that those people who looked at those pictures of starving children connected with various people, they felt closer to people who were completely not like them. Whereas the students just looking at pictures designed to elicit school pride, only connected with people who were the people they were going to become, doctors, lawyers, professionals. So this was a really big piece to me. this whole thing of altruism being, and the activation of the vagus nerve being something that makes us want to connect to people who are not like us. So some of the big intention experiments that I'm planning, and I've got another Middle Eastern experiment focusing on another target on November 12th of this year of 2018. I'm going to have audiences not only of Arabs and Israelis, but also Americans all coming together for this. So I'm looking and rolling this out, but I'm also looking at running experiments like this, for instance, with Democrats and Republicans. I did a little in America. I did a little experiment like this, but I wanted to roll it out on a big scale, because if this is a way, a simple altruistic act is a way for us to allow the heart to leap across the fence, well, then this is pretty big. And I think really one of the real key pieces that you talk about too, Greg, that I think is so important is the power of altruism. You know, I found that in looking at the evidence, altruism is like a bulletproof vest. You know, it makes us, it's not only affecting the world, it affects us positively. You know, it has this extraordinary effect on the immune system, so much so that when they found the vagus nerve was activated by feelings of compassion and all those things you're talking about with heart math, when they looked at cancer patients who could activate the vagus nerve, i.e. do acts of altruism, acts of compassion, actually lived longer. So there's a really key piece here with the whole community idea that really has to do with our self-healing, both globally and individually.
Oh, absolutely, Lynn. And you know, you and I haven't had this conversation before. We were just on the stage together a couple of weeks ago, but we had an audience in front of us, so we couldn't have this conversation. So we had to have an ocean between us so we could come together like this. But I'm not surprised by what you're saying. And the science bears this out so beautifully, because when we can trigger the positive emotions, specifically of gratitude, compassion is a really big one. Gratitude, compassion, appreciation. And what happens is we begin to send a signal from the heart to the brain via the vagus nerve. And what this does is it actually begins to elevate us into a brain state that supports unity rather than separation. It's called the gamma brain state. It's a relatively new kind of brains. There are even newer brain states. There's gamma, there's hypergamma, there's lambda, but this is into a gamma brain state where the frequency of this brain state, the average person can achieve relatively high levels of gamma, right about 40 hertz, 40 cycles per second. So that means that the wave is moving from the center of the brain to the front and the back and front again 40 times per second. A hummingbird's wings are about 50 per second. So that gives you an idea how fast it is. And these are sweeping waves. They sweep through all of the portions of the brain. They're not isolated to one particular portion of the brain. And that creates a unifying effect in the brain. And it gives us a sense of unity in our world. We feel less separate and more connected to the world just from having these feelings. So this is an example where the science is telling us why it's effective, so we know what to do more of. But where this is really beautiful is the effect now, because the heart is the strongest magnetic generator, biomagnetic generator in the human body, we couple our heart's magnetic field with the fundamental magnetic field of the earth, and we actually bring ourselves into harmony with the magnetic fields of the planet. That's why it's so healing for us. What we call healing is actually harmonizing with the field of the world that we live on. But the effect, the magnetic field, it connects everyone and everything on the planet. There's nothing that's not connected. Every blade of grass, every goldfish, every dog, every cat, every CEO of every corporation, every leader of every nation. There is no them and us. And so what the science very clearly is showing, and the experiments after 9/11 really helped to bear this out. 9/11 showed that mass human emotion influenced the magnetic fields of the earth, and in a positive way. because we felt connected. We felt a sense of family when the magnetic fields were high. And when they were lower, we become more aggressive and less willing to cooperate. The question was, can we create the positive effect without a tragedy of 9/11? The answer is yes. And there are a number of different ways. The Institute of Heart Math, for example, has a project. It's the only one of its kind, the only science-based initiative that is designed to bring people, diverse cultures and religions and people of different backgrounds together to transform from chaos to coherence. It's the only science-based project designed to do this. And for transparency, I'll say I'm on the steering committee for the project, and I've worked with this project almost since the inception because I believe in it. So what it's showing is that when we do the things you and I are talking about, Lynn, when we have these altruistic effects in our personal lives and our small groups, that the benefit is not confined to our personal lives and our small groups, that the planet benefits from this. And the studies are showing very clearly, there have been very well documented studies, are in the books and on my website, where people come together and they create this coherence within themselves. It's reflected in the field and in very specific cities. St. Louis is one of them. St. Louis, Chicago, cities like this, crime rates decline during the time that people are having these experiences. Traffic accidents decline. Emergency hospital room visits decline. Violent crimes against people decline. But the key is when people stop what they're doing, those statistics tend to reverse because we have thought of this as something that we do. So we sit down and we make this effect and then we get up and go about our day. And what the studies are now telling us, it's not so much what we do, it's what we become. If we can become these effects, if we can, to the best of our ability, if we can live gratitude and compassion throughout the day, no one is saying, you got to do it 100% every moment of every day. But this is where being consciously aware of our interactions with other people, consciously choosing to be kind, even when we disagree, to disagree in a kind way. It's about self-awareness. To the best of our ability, when we can do that, what we're doing is we're creating a higher level of coherence in our families, in the workplace, in the school, in our communities, and it's actually happening between nations as well. So the science now has come full circle from telling us that we're separate from everything to telling us not only are we connected, but that we influence this connection. And Lynn, you nailed this just a few moments ago, and I wanted, it's not that the field is out there and we're here. We are the field. Every atom in our bodies is constantly emerging from this field. That's what the photons are all about. We are constantly emerging from this field. We are the field, and we are very isolated, very specific parts of the field that are connected with all the other parts of the field. So it's a different way of thinking that we're out here influencing the field than accepting that we are the field, and what we become in our lives, we experience in the world. And I think that's a very, very powerful way to think. We must become in our lives what we choose to experience in the world. And as we become compassion, as we become gratitude, as we become kind, to the best of our ability in our interactions throughout the day, it's actually reflected in a way that the science now is bearing out and the statistics are showing.
Absolutely. And, one thing that's been really interesting watching the Power of Eight, I still didn't believe it when I was seeing these mass healings going on all the time. So I put a group of 250 people into groups of 8, taught them some things for 6 weeks, and then had them go into these groups and monitored them for an entire year. And this is absolutely the case, and I've written about it in my book, The Power of Eight. Of those 250 people, of the people who met regularly, week by week by week, literally 100% of them had major transformations, stroke healings in their lives. They got over chronic depression, lifelong suicidal depression, got over 15 years worth of chronic fatigue. One woman repigmented with her vitiligo. But we also had all kinds of other healings. People got dream jobs. People had financial windfalls. All kinds of things like that happened. So again, I was curious about this, and I was lucky enough to have Life University, which is the largest chiropractic university, offer to put their neuroscience department at my disposal. So they did, and we studied with 7 groups of people in groups of 8, just among the student body, putting EEG caps on the senders, what happened to them. And we found, as you were talking about brainwave and changes, we found that very quickly, these people went into all of the parts of the brain that make us feel separate, particularly the parietal lobes. They sit right here, and they help us navigate what's us and what's not us out there. And they were turned way down. And so were the parts of the brain involved with worry, doubt, negativity. These were brainwave signatures that didn't look anything like meditation. But they were almost identical to the work of Dr. Andrew Newberg, formerly of the University of Pennsylvania, who studied Sufi masters during ecstatic chanting and Buddhist monks during ecstatic prayer. They were essentially brainwave signatures of people in an ecstatic sense of oneness. So here's a takeaway that I found from that. First of all, when people become Sufi masters or Buddhist monks, it takes years of disciplined practice and hours oftentimes of priming to get into that state. My students were all volunteers who had never even meditated before, much less done a Power of 8 group. And all they had was a 12-minute video from me with some of the rudimentaries of how to do it. Nevertheless, they were kind of transported into this ecstatic sense of oneness, this miraculous state where that kind of state is where these kind of healing possibilities, these instant healings can take place. And so I kind of took away from that some things that you've addressed before. These are innate things in our bodies. You know, you don't need ayahuasca, you don't need, a sweat lodge, you don't need years of disciplined practice. You just need to tap into what you already are. And one of the fast tracks to that is a small group, a group and common intentions. And it is your fast track to the miraculous. And so I think this is just one example of some of the modalities we now have at our disposal to feel and change away from this sense of limitation and separateness to open possibility and personal healing. So we've hit the top of the hour, Greg. It's kind of flown by, this conversation. But I wanted to give you an opportunity just to tell everybody about your book and where to get hold of it. And can you hold it up for us? Can we see it?
Yeah, I can hold this. This is the most recent. Let's see. There is for the camera. Human by Design. It's actually 2 books in one, Lynn. And the first part of the book is the science in lay terms, the new discoveries. But I've got all the references in there. I've got an entire chapter of scientific over 30 pages of references. If you want to go and check out where the science is, where peer review, where it's published, where the studies are done. Second part of the book is how do we apply that science in our lives? And I'm actually sharing the instructions. My feeling was I wish I could be live with everyone who reads the book. I know that's not practical. So if I never met the people who are interested in the things that we're talking about, I wanted you people to have the instructions. So I talk about, and actually give the instructions. And Lynn, I so love what you just said, because it's not about a particular, you got to do this meditation, or you've got to, people sometimes are just so hung up on the practice itself. The science is telling us we're wired for this. It's a natural state of being. And the instructions for harmonizing the heart and the brain, I do not call it a meditation, just for the reason that you shared. It is an internal technology. An inner technology. When we harmonize the heart and the brain, 2 organs, one potent system, that's where we begin to shift into those higher brain states that give us the sense of unity and connection, rather than allowing us to stay focused in the parts of the brain that are all about polarity and separation, competition and conflict. And it's very easy to do individually. It's easy to do in a group. Babies live in this state until they're conditioned out of it. So it's a very familiar state of consciousness. But the instructions are in the book, and it's not a meditation. It is an internal technology that we're just remembering in the modern world. So the states, the emotions, Lynn, of compassion and gratitude, the feeling of what it's like to be already healed, those are the emotions that harmonize the heart and the brain, that move us into those higher brain states and release that very powerful healing chemistry into our bodies. So I think this is a place where our work comes together in a really beautiful way. And I just want to say thank you to the work that you are doing and your vision to identify and validate and then bring it to everyday people in a way that is meaningful in their lives. You are such a master at that. And I want to thank you for that and for the opportunity to have this time together today.
Oh, thank you, Greg. It's been so fabulous. And I'm going to do a little last plug for my book, The Power of Eight, which is out in paperback in the States and in the UK, and it's in many other languages now too. And it's also my journey through discovering all of this, plus what's happened with the intention experiments, but also and mainly what's happened with these Power of Eight groups. And there's new information in the American paperback about the latest experiments, but also the latest Power of Eight groups and some of the extraordinary healings we've had. And also my book is two parts too. It's one part of it is this whole story, but the other, and all of the science that I've amassed with it, but the other, and why this works. But the other thing is how to do it, how to set up a Power of Eight group, how to lead a Power of Eight group, the techniques, the best techniques. There's 12 techniques to becoming an intention master that I found based on a lot of scientific evidence and what's worked in a lot of, ancient traditions. And I've distilled them into a simple practice everybody can follow. So my book, The Power of Eight, Greg's book, Human by Design, both available on Amazon in UK, US, and all over the world. We've had such a great time, and it's kind of flown by, Greg. It's always fabulous talking to you. As you say, brother and sister by another mother. And I look forward to seeing you again. Just tell everybody your website for the people in my audience who don't know it.
Thank you so much, Lynn. It's www.greggbraden.com, GreggBraden.com. And Lynn, your website for my people?
Okay, mine is LynneMcTaggart.com, and mine's got an E on the end of Lynn, and McTaggart's got 2 G's and an A-R-T, so it's LynneMcTaggart.com. And there's an area of the website which is /forum. If you don't have 7 friends to set up a Power of Eight group, there's a forum where you can join it and either advertise for a group in your time zone or join an existing group in your time zone. So thank you from both of us. Thank you, Greg. It's been such a thrill to be with you. We'll be posting on Facebook too those URLs for Amazon. So if anybody's interested in getting hold of our books and finding out more, we'd be really grateful.
Thank you so much, Lynn. Love to all of our community, your community, my community, and our family that all works together. I look forward to our next.
Love to you too. Yeah, and to the whole family. It's been wonderful. Thanks so much, guys.